Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. We should be paying very close attention to what the Republican Party is doing to our system of elections here in the United States. They are engaged in an all-out assault on democracy, undermining the voting rights of millions of Americans, especially Black Americans. Their goal is to entrench Republicans in power with no real chance to dislodge them, no matter how large a majority Democrats can put together. This is not hyperbole. If they succeed, the will of the people will mean very little. I'll talk about this with my guest, Eliza Sweren-Becker. She's the counsel to the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Eliza, welcome. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So this all-out war on voting rights did not begin with Donald Trump's absurd claims that the presidential election was stolen. It's been going on for many years. So I'd like to start with one of the biggest blows in recent years to voting rights in this country, and that was the Supreme Court ruling in 2013 that gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what I'd like you to do is sort of kind of briefly explain why the Voting Rights Act was so important and what some of the consequences of that Supreme Court decision have been.
Well, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is in some ways the crown jewel of civil rights legislation in this country. And one of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act required jurisdictions and states, so that could be counties and states, with a history of racial discrimination in voting, to get approval when they changed voting and election policies, either from the Department of Justice or from a federal court in Washington, D.C. So that meant that places with a past of racial discrimination in voting couldn't just enact whatever policies they wanted, perpetuating that discrimination. There had to be a review to check and make sure that the new policies weren't going to discriminate against racial minorities. And in 2013, the Supreme Court took a look at that provision, a set of provisions that collectively are known as pre-clearance, because the new policies would have to be pre-cleared in Washington, D.C. And the Supreme Court said that the formula for determining which jurisdictions were covered had to go through the pre-clearance process. That formula was too old. It wasn't based on sufficiently new data, and there wasn't enough evidence showing that those jurisdictions still racially discriminated in terms of voting and elections. Of course, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a searing dissent in which, I'm paraphrasing, but she said something to the effect of, getting rid of pre-clearance now is like throwing away an umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Effectively, the fact that pre-clearance was working is not a good reason to get rid of this crucial method at preventing discrimination. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court found that formula unconstitutional. And since 2013, we have effectively had no pre-clearance regime. And the result, as you suggested, has been a number of voter suppressive policies that have come out of states since then.
There's nothing subtle about what the Republicans have been doing. These voter suppression efforts have been a mainstay of the Republican Party, not the Democrats. But what's been happening is that these attempts to restrict voting have been specifically targeted at Black voters and other voters of color. In other words, people who lean Democratic. Can you talk about that a little bit, about how specific and in some cases how blatant the party has been?
Absolutely. Well, I think this surge of voter suppressive bills really sort of found its footing the lies about voter fraud and election irregularities that the president was spewing. And of course, those lies were targeted at certain cities: Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta. So the racism element of these allegations about voter fraud is impossible to disentangle because of the locations at which it was targeted. And now we are seeing state lawmakers seize on that same lie about voter fraud, the same lies about election irregularities, to introduce policies that would make it harder to vote. And what we're seeing, for example, initially in Georgia, there were policies to eliminate Sunday voting. Sunday early voting was a day that disproportionately Black voters used because of efforts to get souls to the polls organized by Black churches in Georgia. We also saw an effort in Georgia to eliminate no excuse mail voting, but the attempt to eliminate no excuse mail voting seemed to be in direct backlash to the fact that Black voters used mail voting in greater numbers in 2020, much more than had been true historically. So the initial response of Georgia was to look at ways that Black voters cast their ballots and to try to make those harder. And we're seeing across the country efforts to cut back mail voting now that voters of color and younger voters used that method last year. This is not specific to Georgia, it's really endemic to the whole country.
Now, another way in which Republicans, I mean, essentially they're trying to rig elections so that the other, the Democrats, even if they have a majority of the voters, they're unable to win the elections. But another way in which they've been proceeding has been through extreme partisan gerrymandering. And I've been surprised. I've talked to a number of people personally recently who didn't really understand what gerrymandering was. So can you explain what gerrymandering is? And traditionally it's been used by both parties, but it's the Republicans who have sort of raised it to a high art and now have gone to what I think are grotesque extremes. But if you can explain what gerrymandering is and what are the kinds of things the GOP is doing with it.
Sure. So gerrymandering is actually an approach that is basically as old as the country itself. Politicians have been trying to redraw districts in a manner that would favor their preferred political party or their preferred group for hundreds of years now. But it has, as you said, been taken to a high art because of the ability to parse data in ways that we never have before. And so lawmakers can use the redistricting process to draw districts that effectively lock in a majority for their party, or even a supermajority for an entire decade for the whole redistricting cycle. And what we've seen is that can affect congressional maps in states like Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Virginia. And again, this is a tactic that has been used by both parties, although it has been used very severely and effectively by Republicans to entrench political power in places where they actually wouldn't win so many seats if they didn't draw the districts unfairly. And the result is that it becomes very, very hard to keep elected officials accountable because there are whole, swaths of people that feel like their votes don't count because of the way that they're allocated across districts.
So Democrats are fighting back against voter suppression and against gerrymandering. And two of the major ways are two pieces of proposed legislation. One is called the For the People Act, and the other is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Can you tell us what these bills would do and sort of what their status is at this moment?
Absolutely. So the For the People Act, which is HR 1 and S1, indicating that Congress has given it priority as the first bill introduced in the House and therefore, a big priority for Democratic leadership. HR 1 or the For the People Act makes a number of election-related reforms and a bunch of additional democracy reforms in general. The election-related reforms include things like automatic voter registration, online voter registration, election day registration, early voting for everyone, no excuse vote by mail, protections against improper purges, additional protections against voter intimidation and deceptive practices. So a whole slew of nuts and bolts election reforms that will just make it easier for Americans to get registered, stay registered, and cast their ballots. In addition, there are policies to address partisan gerrymandering, for example, ethics concerns, money in politics. So it is a broad democracy reform bill that will really bring democracy into the 21st century in this country. And it's an essential piece of civil rights legislation along the lines of the Voting Rights Act. In addition, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore the Voting Rights Act. It would strengthen existing provisions, and crucially, it would create a new pre-clearance formula, the formula that the Supreme Court struck down in 2013. It would create a new formula for determining jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination in voting, so that those jurisdictions would have to go through the pre-clearance process. It would also identify particular policies that always have to go through pre-clearance, no matter what jurisdiction tries to implement them, like voter ID laws, closing polling places, number of other policies that we know have discriminatory effects when they're enacted.
I mentioned in the introduction that you're counsel to the Brennan Center for Justice, which is at NYU Law School. And the Brennan Center has been right in the thick of things, and for a long time. This is not recent when it comes to voting rights. Can you talk about the role of the Brennan Center in the fight against voter suppression?
Absolutely. Well, the Brennan Center is a sort of hybrid organization. We are a think tank, so we do research into these issues. We are researching all of the state laws that are attempting to get passed this year to quantify them, to understand what they do, and to know which bills are moving. We are a communications hub, so we then disseminate that information to educate Americans across the country, the media, lawmakers, so they know what's going on. We are an advocacy organization, so we are advocating for the passage of the For the People Act and the Voting Rights Advancement Act, for example, and working in coalition to try to get good laws passed and try to stop bad laws from getting put in place. And finally, we are a public interest law firm. So we litigate against voting laws that we think violate people's voting rights. And we historically have challenged purge laws, felony disenfranchisement laws, for example, and we'll see what this legislative session brings.
We talked a little bit about what's going on in Congress, and you just outlined what the Brennan Center has been doing. What can ordinary people do? Ordinary voters who are, many are really outraged, as they should be, over what's been going on with regard to voting rights. But what can ordinary people do? The most important thing, obviously, is to vote, no matter what kind of roadblocks are thrown in your way. You have to try and overcome those roadblocks. But beyond that, what can people do?
Well, you're absolutely right that the first and most important thing you can do is vote. And the reason why I emphasize that again is that I don't just mean in federal elections every 2 years. I mean in the local and state elections that happen sometimes off cycle, because state lawmakers are writing these election laws. And in order to have a say on what election laws govern your state, you really need to vote for your state reps. You need to vote for your county clerks because they are implementing election administration. It's essential that we all think of democracy as a 365-day process. It's not just a one day in November event. In addition to voting, folks should write their state assembly members and state senators and ask them to vote no on policies that they oppose, policies that make it harder to vote, and to ask them to vote yes on policies that would make it easier for Americans to vote.
So I'm assuming that this voting rights legislation in Congress, that there will be unified Republican opposition to this. Do you have any sense of the prospects? Is this another case where the filibuster can be used to block voting rights, which it has traditionally been used to block voting rights? And is this a case where the filibuster would need to be adjusted or gotten rid of in order to get this voting rights legislation passed?
Well, I don't have a whip count of the Republican senators, but I think it is very likely that some sort of filibuster reform would be necessary to get these voting rights bills passed. What I think is important is that we tell our lawmakers and our senators that we want free, fair, and equal access to voting. And that's what we care about. So they can, if they have to reform the filibuster in one way or another to make that happen, that's fine. But I think our representatives need to hear from us what our values are. And the parliamentary procedures that the Senate undertakes to get them done is really up to them, but they need to know that we absolutely need to pass the For the People Act.
Now, I haven't seen any polling on this, but I'm assuming that there's pretty substantial public support for voting rights in general, in kind of a vague sense, that people would like it to be easier to vote. I think they would like the system to be streamlined. But have you found that that's the case? Do you have a sense of that?
Absolutely. So the policies that HR 1, the For the People Act, would implement are very popular. People love automatic voter registration. They love early voting. They love no excuse by mail. These are policies that are implemented already in many states across the country. They make it easier for people to vote regardless of political party, and they are extremely popular. It's also worth noting that the Voting Rights Act historically was reenacted over the years with Republican support, with unanimous Republican support in many instances. So voting rights didn't used to be this partisan political football that it has become. And that's because, of course, every American should have equal access to the ballot. And that's something that we used to know and sort of hold true in our hearts. And I think maybe could be true again.
One of the things that I think has not gotten a lot of attention, and maybe that's because it particularly bothers me, but it's been the Republican push to elect secretaries of state and attorneys general at the state level, whose specific goal, whose campaign promises would be to sort of take whatever steps are necessary to ensure Republican victory. So in the wake of the presidential election, we saw some, in a number of cases, Republican secretaries of state and other officials who did what they were required by law to do in terms of certifying votes and that sort of thing. They did not succumb to the pressure from Trump and his supporters to throw out Democratic votes or to conduct bogus investigations and that sort of thing. But you mentioned the importance of people voting in state and local elections. How concerned should we be that there can be a wave of these officials going into office who can interfere with legitimate election results? Is that a real concern?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that roles like the state attorney generals and secretaries of state are really powerful positions in states of the country. And it's essential that people pay attention to who's on the ballot for those positions and vote in races where those positions are at issue. We did see last year, sort of across the board, from the state to the most local election officials, for the most part, those election officials really held the line and they committed themselves to upholding the rule of law, withstanding enormous amounts of pressure, including from the president himself. And that was true even of secretaries of state, like the current Secretary of State of Georgia, who historically has not been a particular friend to vote.
Right.
Already we see that person, Secretary Raffensperger, being challenged by someone from the right and someone who has already been endorsed by the former president. So I do think there may be an effort to try to put in place secretaries of state and other election officials that may be perceived as more compliant with the political whims of the day. But ultimately, it's a violation of many laws for secretaries of state to abuse their power, to fail to follow state and federal law. And I would expect that, sort of regardless of who ultimately sits in that office, that they take an oath of office, to protect their state constitution and their constituents, and that they will uphold that oath, and withstand whatever pressure may come their way.
So we've had a president, now the former president, who insisted that the election was stolen from him. We've had members of Congress unwilling to certify the legitimate results of that election. We had a violent, murderous insurrection at the Capitol of the United States. And some of the people who were part of that invasion of the Capitol were threatening to hang the vice president of the United States. And we have all of this voter suppression that you and I have been talking about. In your view, how big a risk to our democracy are we actually facing in this country at this moment? And I say that with the knowledge that we all have that there are very slim majorities that the Democrats hold in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So how big a risk?
Well, for all the reasons that you just articulated, I think we are in an exceedingly urgent moment, and we need to step up to protect our democracy. But I also have some optimism because we have this opportunity to enact sort of the biggest civil rights package that has been enacted in many decades in this country with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act. If the insurrection and the lies about voter fraud and the attempt to overturn elections has taught us anything, it's that we absolutely need this federal legislation to protect voters and to protect our democracy. So I'm hopeful because I think maybe finally Americans across the country and Congress understand the urgency with which they have to act to protect our democracy. And those two pieces of legislation would give us a huge step forward to ensuring that we are not so vulnerable to the kinds of threats and attacks that we saw over the last several months.
So you're the expert, so I'm going to go along with your view of the situation and try to be optimistic. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. In the go ahead, I cut you off.
I was just going to say, I have to be optimistic in order to keep doing my job. I think it's part of the job description, and it's what keeps us moving. So it's necessary, but I also think it's true that we really have an opportunity that we can seize on that can make democracy in this country stronger.
You've sort of anticipated my final question in our last couple of minutes. I wanted to ask you, you're a lawyer and someone comes out of law school with a broad array of opportunities or roads that you can pursue. What drew you to voting rights? How did you become so involved in voting rights?
Well, the right to vote is the right that lets us protect all of our other civil rights. If we can't keep our elected representatives accountable, then every other right that we hold dear is vulnerable. So to me, being involved in voting rights and elections and trying to protect that right to vote is essential to protecting the rest of the things that I value in American democracy. So that's what drew me to this work. And I think there is always room to improve, and that's what we're working to do. But it's also a space where I think we can win. And we, the progress of HR 1 through the House again this year is a sign, and that I think there are, good things ahead for American democracy.
We've been talking with Eliza Sweren-Becker of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Eliza, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
To our viewers, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.